What's the worst way you've seen someone propose at a wedding? Story 1. It was my sister's wedding, and everything was going perfect. The ceremony was beautiful, the food was delicious, and everyone was having a great time. But then, someone decided to ruin it all. Max, a friend of the groom, was always a bit quirky, but no one expected him to do something like this. As the newlyweds raised their glasses to toast, Max suddenly stood up and started tapping his glass with a fork. The room fell silent. He announced that he had something important to say. Everyone thought he was just offering a speech or congratulating the couple, but no. He turned to his girlfriend, Kate, and got down on one knee. At first, it seemed like a sweet gesture, until he started proposing. People initially thought it was just a spontaneous moment of love, but as he asked her to marry him right there, in front of everyone, things took an awkward turn. Kate was clearly uncomfortable. She looked stunned, and for a moment, no one knew how to react. The bride's face was pale, and the groom looked furious. It was clear something was wrong. Kate was crying, but not tears of joy. She quietly whispered to him that this was not the time or place. She ran out of the room, leaving Max standing there with the open ring box, utterly embarrassed. The awkwardness lingered in the air, and the atmosphere shifted dramatically. The guests didn't know whether to laugh or comfort him, while the newlyweds were obviously angry and upset by the interruption. The next day, we learned that Kate had broken up with Max. She said she couldn't be with someone who didn't respect the significance of other people's moments. The whole incident was a harsh reminder: never propose at someone else's wedding. It's a surefire way to ruin both the event and your relationship. Story 2. It was the perfect summer afternoon when we gathered for Tom and Lily's wedding. The venue was stunning. A cozy little vineyard surrounded by lush green hills. Guests were seated at long tables adorned with white flowers and candles, and the air was filled with the sounds of soft music and laughter. Everyone was in high spirits and the couple was glowing with happiness. But there was something that would completely shift the energy of the day, a proposal that no one saw coming. Dylan, Tom's childhood friend, had always been the life of the party. He was charismatic, charming, and had a reputation for doing things a little different. No one knew exactly what he had planned for this special day, but we soon found out. As the evening went on, the dance floor began to fill, and the drinks started flowing. People were mingling, laughing, and enjoying themselves when suddenly Dylan, with a mischievous grin on his face, made his way up to the microphone. He was a bit tipsy, but it didn't seem out of the ordinary for him. The music stopped, and the room fell silent. Everyone turned to him, curious about what he was about to say. Dylan began speaking, his words slurring slightly, but his tone was playful. He mentioned how much he loved Tom and Lily, how they were his best friends, and how he'd been waiting for this moment his whole life. We all assumed he was giving a heartfelt toast, but then he did the unexpected. He turned to the woman sitting beside him, Claire, and got down on one knee. At first, we all thought it was a joke. Dylan had a history of pulling pranks, and this seemed like one of his usual antics. But as he pulled out a ring, it became painfully clear that this wasn't a joke at all. Dylan was proposing to Claire, right there, in the middle of Tom and Lily's wedding reception. The room went completely still. Claire's face turned pale, and she awkwardly laughed, unsure of how to respond. It was as though everyone collectively held their breath. Tom and Lily, who had been the center of attention all evening, looked absolutely stunned. Their faces were a mix of confusion and disbelief. No one knew what to do, and the moment stretched on uncomfortably. Finally, Claire, still looking shell-shocked, said something to Dylan. She wasn't exactly rejecting him, but she wasn't accepting the proposal either. She managed a weak smile, and after a long pause, she stood up and walked out of the room. Dylan, still on one knee, was left holding the ring, his grin quickly fading into embarrassment. The tension in the room was palpable. People started whispering, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Some awkward clapping ensued, but it was clear that no one knew how to recover from such an uncomfortable moment. Tom and Lily, still in shock, quietly left the room as well, and the atmosphere shifted from celebratory to awkward. By the time the night was over, we all knew that Dylan's proposal had completely derailed what was supposed to be one of the happiest days of Tom and Lily's lives. He tried to apologize later, but the damage was done. Claire never did give him an answer, and to this day, I'm not sure if they ever worked things out. The whole event became a cautionary tale, one we all remembered every time someone joked about doing something dramatic at a wedding. It was a lesson learned the hard way. Never steal the spotlight at someone else's big day, especially with something as personal as a proposal. Story 3. It was a crisp autumn day when the wedding of Sarah and Jason took place. The venue was an old barn, beautifully decorated with fairy lights and rustic flowers, creating the perfect atmosphere for their big day. The ceremony went off without a hitch, and guests were enjoying themselves at the reception, chatting and laughing as they waited for dinner to be served. Everything seemed to be going according to plan, until one uninvited guest decided to make a grand entrance. Danny, a close friend of Jason's from college, had always been a bit eccentric. He wasn't exactly someone who followed social norms, and he had a reputation for making awkward situations even more uncomfortable. We all knew Danny, and we all expected him to do something unusual, but none of us were prepared for what happened next. As the evening unfolded, people were mingling and enjoying drinks when Danny stood up and casually made his way to the front of the room. Without any warning, he grabbed the microphone from the DJ and the music came to a screeching halt. The room immediately went quiet. Everyone turned to look at Danny, unsure of what was happening. He grinned widely, seemingly oblivious to the tension building in the air. Danny began by congratulating Sarah and Jason on their beautiful wedding, and then, out of nowhere, he announced that he had a surprise of his own. No one knew what he was talking about, but we all assumed it would be a funny speech or maybe a joke. But then things took an unexpected turn. Danny started telling a story about how he had secretly been in love with Sarah for years. His words started off lighthearted, but they quickly took a darker turn. He talked about how he had always had feelings for her, even though she'd never known, and how he had secretly hoped that one day they might end up together. He went on to say that he was tired of hiding his feelings, and that he needed to get this off his chest even if it was on the day of her wedding. The room was stunned. Sarah, sitting at the head table with Jason, looked like she had been slapped. Her face went pale as Danny continued to confess his love. Jason, who had been laughing at first, immediately became visibly upset. The awkward silence that followed was unbearable. No one knew how to react. As Danny finished his emotional monologue, he turned to Sarah and told her that he couldn't let her marry Jason without first telling her the truth. He then looked at her expectantly, as if waiting for her to say something, anything. Sarah, looking horrified and uncomfortable, managed to stand up and walk away from the table. Jason, clearly angry now, stood up as well, his hands clenched into fists. The tension in the room was palpable. Danny stood there, still holding the microphone, clearly unaware of the chaos he had just caused. The guests looked between him, Sarah, and Jason, unsure of what to do. Sarah quickly left the room, and Jason followed closely behind, trying to contain his frustration. The awkward silence stretched on for what felt like forever. It wasn't until about 20 minutes later that Sarah returned. She looked shaken but composed. Jason stood by her side, his face still showing signs of anger, but they both managed to smile politely for the guests. Danny, realizing the magnitude of his mistake, tried to apologize, but the damage had already been done. He was quickly ushered out of the venue, and no one really spoke to him for the rest of the night. In the end, Sarah and Jason's wedding continued, but the mood had shifted. It was clear that Danny's public declaration had overshadowed their special day, and while the rest of the evening went on without further incidents, it was never quite the same. People couldn't stop talking about the awkward proposal that wasn't really a proposal at all. Sarah and Jason went on to have a strong marriage, but the story of Danny's ill-timed confession became a cautionary tale. It reminded us all that there are certain boundaries you just don't cross, especially on someone else's wedding day. If you have feelings for someone, it's probably best to keep them to yourself, at least until after the wedding. Story 4. It was a chilly evening in November when Anna and Mark were getting married at a charming little chapel nestled in the countryside. The ceremony was intimate, with only close family and friends in attendance, and everything had gone smoothly up until that point. The guests were seated for the reception, the food was being served, and the dance floor was ready for the celebration to begin. It was the kind of wedding where everything felt perfect, until one of the groom's old friends, Peter, decided to shake things up. Peter was someone no one could quite figure out. He had always been a bit eccentric, and was known for doing things that left everyone questioning his sense of timing and judgment. He had been friends with Mark since high school, and though they'd grown apart in recent years, Peter was still invited to the wedding. What happened next would be talked about for years. As people began settling in at their tables after dinner, Peter stood up. He grabbed his glass of wine, made his way to the center of the room, and grabbed the microphone from the DJ. Everyone assumed he was about to give a toast, but they were all in for a surprise. Peter had something else on his mind. He started by raising his glass and saying a few words of congratulations to Anna and Mark. He thanked them for inviting him to their special day, and the guests gave him a polite round of applause. But then, just as everyone was starting to relax, Peter dropped a bombshell. He began to talk about his relationship with Anna. He spoke about how they had been close friends for years before she met Mark, and how they'd shared so many special memories. But then, with an unexpected tone of seriousness, Peter said that he had always had feelings for her, even though she had never felt the same. He confessed that he had never truly let go of those feelings, and that seeing her marry someone else was harder than he had imagined. The room went dead silent. Anna, who had been smiling just moments before, suddenly looked like she had been struck by a bolt of light. Her face turned pale, and her hand instinctively reached for Mark's, as if seeking comfort. Mark, visibly upset, narrowed his eyes at Peter but remained silent for the moment. The tension in the air was thick, and no one knew what would happen next. Peter continued, saying that he didn't want to hold anything back and that he had to let Anna know how he felt right then and there. He said it wasn't just about confessing his love. He wanted to give her one last chance to think about what she was doing, about what she was about to lose. The other guests exchanged uncomfortable glances, unsure of how to react. At this point, Anna couldn't take it anymore. She stood up abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor, and turned to Peter with tears in her eyes. She tried to keep her composure, but her voice shook as she told him that it was too late, that they were both past that. She thanked him for his honesty, but made it clear that she had already made her choice, and it was Mark. The room was still frozen, but Mark finally stood up, walked over to Peter, and without saying a word, grabbed the microphone from his hand. He looked at Peter with a mixture of anger and disbelief, before calmly telling him to leave. Peter tried to argue, but Mark's words were final. Slowly, Peter left the room, and the guests were left in a stunned silence. What followed was a brief period of awkwardness. Anna and Mark tried to regain control of the situation, but the mood had definitely shifted. The rest of the evening passed without incident, but people couldn't stop whispering about what had just transpired. Peter's actions had left a mark on the night, and while the wedding continued, it was clear that something had been taken from Anna and Mark's special day. In the months that followed, Peter reached out to both Anna and Mark with apologies, but the damage was done. His actions had left Anna feeling violated and uncomfortable, and Mark couldn't quite get past the fact that Peter had tried to disrupt one of the most important moments of their lives. As for Peter, he seemed to retreat into the shadows, his friendship with Mark now irreparably damaged. The wedding went down in history as one of the most memorable ones anyone had ever attended, but for all the wrong reasons. And the lesson was clear. When it comes to weddings, timing is everything. If you have something to say, make sure it's not at someone else's expense. Story 5. It was the kind of wedding where everything seemed to be falling into place. The sun was shining, the flowers were in full bloom, and the guests were eagerly awaiting the arrival of the bride and groom. It was a beautiful vineyard ceremony, with rows of grapevines stretching as far as the eye could see, and the tables were elegantly set with candles and crystal glasses. Lily and David were a couple deeply in love, and everyone could see it. They had known each other for years and had waited for this moment for what seemed like an eternity. As the ceremony unfolded, the vows were exchanged, and the rings slipped onto fingers with tender promises. The guests clapped and cheered, and the newlyweds shared a passionate kiss as they were officially announced as husband and wife. The air was filled with joy, and the reception started off in full swing. But there was one person who didn't seem to share in the happiness. Carla, Lily's childhood friend, had always been a bit of a wild card. She had been in love with David for years, long before Lily had entered the picture. And although she never openly confessed it, everyone knew. Carla had always kept her emotions hidden. But deep down, everyone suspected that she was harboring feelings for David that went far beyond friendship. Little did we know, this wedding would be the day that Carla's feelings came to light in the most dramatic way. As the evening progressed and the wine began to flow freely, guests began dancing and enjoying themselves. The atmosphere was lively, with people laughing and chatting. At some point, Carla got up from her seat, seemingly excited to make her way to the dance. However, instead of joining the group, she made a beeline for the front of the room where the microphone was set up for speeches. Carla grabbed the mic, her face flushed from the alcohol, and the room fell silent. At first, everyone assumed she was just going to give a heartfelt speech, perhaps one about her friendship with Lily. But Carla had other plans. She began by talking about how happy she was for Lily and David, how much she admired their love. But as the words left her mouth, it became clear that something wasn't quite right. She started speaking about the first time she met David, how they had always been close friends, how they shared personal moments and deep conversations. As she spoke, she began to linger on the idea of what could have been if things had turned out different. Her voice quivered as she revealed that she had loved David for as long as she could remember, and that seeing him marry Lily was a bittersweet experience. The guests looked around, exchanging confused and uncomfortable glances. Lily's smile faded as she processed Carla's words. David, who had been standing by Lily's side, shifted uncomfortably and looked away. Carla wasn't finished yet. In a moment of what seemed like desperation, she declared that she would never forgive herself if she didn't confess her feelings now, in front of everyone. She told David that she loved him and had always loved him, and that she had hoped for years that he might choose her instead. The room was stunned. It felt as though time had stopped. Lily looked like she had been slapped in the face. She slowly turned to David, searching his face for any sign that he might feel the same. David stood there, paralyzed with embarrassment and shock. The awkwardness hung thick in the air and no one knew what to do or say. David finally found his voice. He gently took the microphone from Carla and, in a calm but firm voice, told her that he was deeply grateful for her friendship, but that he loved Lily, and nothing could change that. Carla's face flushed with a mixture of anger and humiliation. She briefly looked down, took a deep breath, and quietly left the room without saying another word. The tension in the room remained, but the night continued. After the awkward moment passed, the guests tried to go back to enjoying the evening, but the mood was definitely shifted. Lily was clearly upset, though she tried to mask it with a smile. David kept glancing at her, checking if she was okay. It was clear that their perfect day had been marred by Carla's ill-timed outburst. Later, after the wedding was over, Lily and David had a private conversation, and though they both tried to move past the incident, the damage was done. Carla's feelings had disrupted what should have been a perfect day, and the friendship between her and Lily would never be the same. Carla eventually reached out to apologize, but the harm had already been done. Lily and David's wedding was still memorable, but it would always be remembered for that awkward confession. It was a harsh reminder to everyone. If you're carrying unspoken feelings, it's best to keep them to yourself, especially on someone else's wedding day. Story 6. It was a warm summer afternoon when Sarah and James got married at an elegant countryside estate. The setting was picture-perfect, with a sprawling garden filled with roses and peonies and an old stone chapel where the ceremony would take place. The air smelled of fresh blooms, and the sounds of birds chirping filled the air. The guests were eagerly awaiting the bride's arrival, and everyone could feel the excitement. It was a beautiful day for a beautiful couple, or so we thought. Sarah and James had been together for over 6 years, and everyone knew they were meant to be. Their love story was one of those that made everyone believe in true love. The ceremony was emotional, the vows heartfelt, and the exchange of rings brought tears to many eyes. The couple sealed their commitment with a kiss, and the guests cheered as they walked down the aisle as husband and wife. The celebration began, and everything seemed to be unfolding perfectly. As the evening wore on, the guests mingled, enjoyed delicious food, and the music played softly in the background. Laughter filled the air as old friends caught up, and the newlyweds shared their first dance. It was a moment of pure joy for everyone in attendance. But little did we know, one person in the room had something else in mind. Dan, James's childhood friend, had always been the joker of the group. He was always the one to crack jokes and stir things up. But there was something different about him that day. He had been drinking more than usual, and his behavior seemed to get a little more erratic as the night went on. None of us paid much attention at first. After all, weddings are full of excitement and merrymaking. But then, as the evening approached its peak, Dan stood up from his table and made his way to the center of the dance floor. He grabbed the microphone from the DJ's stand, and the room went silent. Everyone turned to look, assuming he was about to make a funny toast or say something in celebration of the couple. But what Dan said next would completely change the course of the evening. He began by praising Sarah and James's relationship, recounting some old memories from their childhood and university days. He spoke with a sense of nostalgia, as if reminiscing about the good old days. At first, it seemed innocent enough, until he turned his focus to Sarah. Dan suddenly told the entire room that he had once been in love with Sarah, long before she met James. He spoke about how they had been close friends for years, how he had secretly hoped that one day she would realize that they were meant to be together. His words grew more intense, and he admitted that he had never really gotten over her. The silence in the room was deafening. Sarah, sitting next to James, looked like she had just seen a ghost. Her smile faded, and her eyes went wide with shock. James, who had been smiling and enjoying the moment, suddenly froze. His face went pale, and the joy he had just moments ago was replaced with disbelief. Dan continued, saying that he couldn't stay silent any longer. He confessed that he had hoped this moment would come. And even though he knew Sarah had chosen James, he couldn't help but feel like he was losing the love of his life. He looked directly at Sarah and said that he still loved her and always would. The room was so still, it was as if time had stopped. The guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unsure of what to do. Sarah was visibly shaken. James, now standing beside her, looked ready to explode. After a long pause, Sarah stood up and with tears in her eyes, said in a calm but firm voice, "Dan, I love James, and I always have. I can't change the past, but I've chosen him." Dan didn't seem to take the rejection well. He stood there for a moment, visibly hurt, before muttering an apology and stumbling off the dance floor. The tension in the room was palpable, and the atmosphere had completely shifted. Sarah and James, though obviously upset, tried to keep things together. They held hands, smiled weakly, and resumed the celebration, but the mood had been irrevocably altered. The rest of the evening passed in awkwardness. People tried to dance and enjoy themselves, but the earlier joy had been tainted by Dan's outburst. Sarah and James did their best to salvage the night, but the event would always be remembered for that uncomfortable, unexpected moment. In the months following the wedding, Dan tried to apologize to both Sarah and James, but the damage was done. His actions had left a scar on their perfect day, and though he was still a friend, things were never quite the same between them. Sarah and James eventually moved on, but they both agreed that weddings were sacred moments, meant to celebrate love, not to air unresolved feelings. It was a lesson learned the hard way. Some things are better left unsaid, especially on someone else's special day. Story 7. It was a sunny spring day when Olivia and Ben decided to get married at a beautiful lakeside resort. The ceremony was set outdoors, surrounded by towering trees and blooming flowers with the soft sound of the water in the background. Their guests were treated to an idyllic setting as they gathered for the celebration. The air was fresh, and the atmosphere was filled with excitement and joy. It seemed like nothing could go wrong, until it did. Olivia and Ben had been together for 4 years. Their love was the kind of story that people would call storybook. They were perfect for each other, and it seemed as though nothing could ever come between them. Friends and family had gathered from far and wide to witness their special day, and the anticipation was palpable. After the ceremony, the reception was held inside the resort's grand hall. The decorations were elegant, the food was exquisite, and the champagne flowed freely. Guests mingled, sharing stories and laughter, and the newlyweds shared their first dance. It was the kind of celebration where everything seemed to be unfolding perfectly, until someone decided to make it all about themselves. Max, Ben's best friend since childhood, had been a bit of a wild card. He was always the life of the party, the one who could always make everyone laugh with his offbeat humor and spontaneous antics. He was also known for being a little unpredictable, but no one ever thought that he might cause trouble at Ben's wedding. Boy, were we wrong. As the evening wore on, the music picked up and the dance floor was packed. People were having a great time, and the energy in the room was electric. But then suddenly, Max took the microphone from the DJ. The music came to an abrupt stop, and everyone turned to look. We all assumed he was about to give a funny speech, maybe share a few old memories of his friendship with Ben. Instead, Max started by talking about how happy he was for Ben and Olivia, how perfect they were for each other, and how lucky they were to find true love. It seemed harmless at first, but then Max said something that shocked everyone in the room. Max admitted that for years, he had been secretly in love with Olivia. He went on to explain that long before Olivia and Ben had become a couple, Max had feelings for her that he never told anyone about. He admitted that he had hoped for a long time that Olivia might somehow end up with him instead of Ben. He made it clear that he had never gotten over his feelings for her, and even now seeing her marry Ben was incredibly painful. The room fell silent. Olivia's face drained of color, and her eyes widened in disbelief. Ben stood there frozen, a mix of confusion and anger spreading across his face. The guests exchanged uncomfortable glances, unsure of how to react to Max's sudden, unprovoked confession. Max continued, saying that he couldn't hold it in any longer, that he needed Olivia to know how he truly felt. He turned to her and in front of everyone declared that he still loved her and always would. He even asked her if she was absolutely certain about marrying Ben, as if she might somehow change her mind in that very moment. Olivia, stunned and hurt, took a deep breath and stood up. She turned to Ben, looking at him for support before facing Max. Her voice trembled slightly, but she spoke with clarity. She told him that she valued their friendship, but she had never seen him in that way. She loved Ben and had chosen him, and there was no turning back. She apologized for the hurt that Max must have been feeling, but she made it clear that her heart belonged to Ben. Max looked devastated. He stood there for a moment, staring at Olivia, before awkwardly backing away from the microphone. He muttered something about just needing to get it off his chest, and walked out of the room, leaving the wedding guests in a state of shock. The mood in the room shifted dramatically. It was as though someone had flipped a switch. Olivia and Ben tried to continue with their evening, but it was clear that the atmosphere had been irreparably changed. The guests tried to resume the festivities, but the excitement that had filled the air earlier had been replaced by a thick layer of discomfort. As the night wore on, Olivia and Ben did their best to salvage what was left of their celebration, but Max's outburst had cast a long shadow over the event. The next day, Ben spoke with Max, and while he tried to understand his friend's feelings, he couldn't shake the anger and betrayal he felt. Olivia, too, had a heart-to-heart with Max, but she was hurt by his lack of respect for their special day. In the end, Max apologized, but the damage was done. Olivia and Ben's wedding would always be remembered for that uncomfortable confession. Max's actions not only disrupted the day, but also left a permanent scar on their relationship. The lesson, as everyone in the room learned that evening, was clear. Never, ever confess your feelings for someone on their wedding day. It's a moment meant to be cherished, not ruined. Story 8. The wedding was in full swing, the dance floor packed, laughter echoing through the hall. The bride and groom had just finished their first dance, when suddenly the music cut off. Confused murmurs spread as everyone turned toward the center of the room. There, standing on a chair, was Mark, holding a microphone. His girlfriend Lisa sat frozen at their table, her face drained of color. Mark cleared his throat, beaming. Everyone! Sorry to interrupt, but I just realized something important today. A pause. I can't imagine my life without Lisa. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Lisa's eyes widened in horror. The bride and groom exchanged a look of disbelief. Mark pulled a small velvet box from his pocket, flipping it open with a dramatic flourish. Lisa, will you marry me? Silence. The bride's jaw clenched. The groom exhaled sharply. All eyes were on Lisa, whose hands trembled in her lap. The spotlight, uninvited, was now blinding. Seconds stretched into eternity. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, Lisa said, Mark, what are you doing? Mark laughed, as if she was joking. Come on, babe. Everyone's here. It's perfect. The bride, gripping her champagne flute so tightly it threatened to shatter, took a deep breath. The groom, less patient, stepped forward. Dude, not cool. Mark waved him off. Relax, it's a happy moment. Right, Lisa? His voice wavered. Lisa's face said it all. She stood slowly, the chair scraping against the floor. I can't believe this. Mark frowned, still kneeling. Lisa? Tears welled in her eyes, but not the happy kind. You really thought this was the right time? His expression shifted. First confusion, then realization. He glanced at the bride, who was now visibly seething. The weight of what he had done finally hit him. Lisa shook her head, turned, and walked away. Mark jumped up, reaching for her arm. Lisa, wait! She yanked free, disappearing through the doors without another word. The room buzzed with whispers. The groom exhaled. Well, let's get the music back on. The DJ hesitated, then pressed play. The beat dropped. People cheered. And just like that, the wedding moved on. But Mark? He stood there, alone, the ring still in his hand, as the party continued without him. Story 9. The wedding reception was flawless. Golden lights twinkling, music floating through the air, guests laughing over champagne. The bride and groom, radiant with joy, had just stepped onto the dance floor for their first dance when a sudden scraping sound cut through the melody. At the back of the room, a man stood, tapping his glass with a people turned. The bride's smile faltered. It was Ryan, the groom's best man. But instead of a toast, he turned toward his girlfriend, Megan, who sat frozen in her seat, eyes wide with alarm. Ryan grinned. Sorry to steal the moment, guys, but I just can't wait another second. He dropped to one knee. Gasps rippled across the room. Megan's face went pale. A murmur of disbelief spread. The bride stiffened, her fingers tightening around her husband's arm. The groom's expression darkened. Ryan flipped open a ring box. Megan, I love you more than words can say. Seeing our best friends tie the knot today made me realize I want that with you. Megan's breath hitched. Her fingers curled against the tablecloth. The silence was deafening. Someone in the crowd whispered, Oh my God. The bride stepped forward, her smile now razor sharp. Ryan, she said, her voice eerily calm. Are you serious right now? Ryan barely glanced at her. It's the perfect moment. He turned back to Megan, eyes full of expectation. So what do you say? Megan looked at the ring, then at Ryan. Her lips parted, but no words came out. Then she let out a slow exhale. This is not happening, she muttered under her breath. Standing so abruptly, her chair nearly tipped over. Ryan's smile faltered. Megan. She took a step back. You think this is romantic? Hijacking someone else's wedding. The crowd stirred, guests exchanging glances. The bride folded her arms. The groom clenched his jaw. Ryan's confidence wavered, but he forced a chuckle. Come on, babe. Everyone's watching. Just say yes. Megan shook her head. I can't believe you. Ryan swallowed. Wait, you don't mean that. But Megan didn't wait. She turned and strode toward the exit, her heels clicking against the floor. Ryan scrambled to his feet. Megan, wait! The doors swung shut behind her. A thick, awkward silence lingered until the DJ, understanding his duty, pressed play. The music returned. The bride lifted her glass. To new beginnings, she said coldly. The crowd laughed, the tension snapped, and the wedding went on. Ryan, however, stood alone, staring at the unopened ring box in his trembling hands. Story 10. The wedding was the kind people dream about. An elegant outdoor ceremony, golden sunlight filtering through the trees, and love in the air. The reception was even better. Laughter and clinking glasses filled the grand ballroom, the newlyweds basking in the glow of their perfect day. Then, during the toasts, it happened. Chris, the groom's childhood best friend, took the mic, swaying slightly from one too many drinks. The bride and groom exchanged a glance but smiled politely. Chris cleared his throat. Wow, what a beautiful night. I mean, seriously, guys, you've outdone yourselves. He hiccuped. People chuckled nervously. Then he turned, locking eyes with his girlfriend, Sarah, seated near the front. And speaking of love, he said, a sudden seriousness creeping into his voice, I've been thinking a lot today. Watching my best friend marry the love of his life made me realize something. Sarah stiffened. The bride's fingers tightened around her champagne flute. The groom looked wary. Chris dropped to one knee. Gasps shot through the crowd. Sarah's face went completely blank. Sarah, he said, flipping open a small velvet box. Will you marry me? Dead silence. The only sound was the soft hum of the venue's chandelier. The bride's lips pressed into a thin line. The groom muttered something under his breath. Sarah's face shifted from shock to horror. Chris, she said slowly, barely above a whisper. Chris grinned, assuming she was overwhelmed with joy. I know. Surprise, right? He chuckled, but I couldn't think of a better moment. Sarah's chair scraped as she stood. You couldn't think of a better moment? Her voice was low, dangerous. At someone else's wedding? Chris blinked. Yeah? The bride exhaled sharp. The groom pinched the bridge of his nose. Sarah's eyes darted around, taking in the stunned faces. Chris, she said, her voice shaking, this is not okay. A nervous chuckle rippled through the guests. Chris swallowed. But, Sarah shook her head. I can't do this. Chris's smile faltered. What? I can't do this. She turned, walked straight toward the exit, her heels clicking sharply on the marble. Chris shot to his feet. Sarah, wait. The bride finally snapped. Oh, hell no. The groom grabbed Chris's arm before he could chase after Sarah. You're done, man. Sit down. The room held its breath. Chris hesitated, looking between the exit and his abandoned proposal. Then, shoulders slumping, he sank into his seat, the little velvet box still open in his palm. The DJ, sensing the moment, restarted the music. Guests exhaled, the tension dissolving. The bride lifted her glass. Now that that's over, let's party. The guests cheered. Chris? He sat there, staring at the empty space where Sarah had been. Story 11. The wedding was the kind you see in movies. White roses everywhere, a live band playing soft jazz, and a chandelier that sparkled like 1,000 tiny stars. The bride and groom were glowing, their love radiating through the ballroom. Everything was perfect, until it wasn't. During the dinner, as the guests chatted over their meals, a sudden hush fell over the room. A waiter had accidentally dropped a glass, shattering it against the floor. But that wasn't what caught everyone's attention. It was the man standing at his table, clearing his throat. All eyes turned to him. It was Jake, the bride's ex-boyfriend. The bride's face drained of color. The groom stiffened, gripping his fork a little too tightly. Jake raised his glass. I just need to say something. The guests shifted uncomfortably. The bride's mother whispered something urgently to her husband. The best man shot the groom a worried glance. Jake took a deep breath. I know this isn't ideal, but I can't sit here and watch this happen without saying what I feel. The bride's hands clenched in her lap. I love you, Jake said, his voice breaking. I always have. A collective gasp rippled through the room. Someone coughed. A woman at the next table muttered, Oh no, he didn't. The groom slowly placed his napkin on the table. His jaw was tight. Jake took a step forward. I know I messed up. I should have fought for you. But seeing you walk down that aisle today, knowing you're about to spend your life with someone else, I can't let that happen. The silence was suffocating. The bride finally stood, her eyes blazing. Jake, sit down. Jake hesitated. Sit down, the groom repeated, his voice low, dangerous. Jake turned to the guests, looking for support. He found none. The bride took a step closer, voice trembling with rage. You had your chance, years ago, and you threw it away. Jake's confidence wavered. The bride shook her head. This is my wedding, my moment, and you are ruining it. Jake swallowed hard. His hands shook. Slowly, he lowered his glass. The groom leaned in. Leave. Now. Jake hesitated for one agonizing second. Then, shoulders sagging, he turned and walked toward the exit. The doors shut behind him. A breath of relief passed through the room. Then the DJ, bless his soul, pressed play. The music returned, and just like that, the wedding went on. The bride sat back down, exhaled, and took the groom's hand. He squeezed it. Still perfect, he whispered. She smiled. And just like that, it was. Story 12. The wedding had been nothing short of magical, the kind of event people would talk about for years. The venue was stunning. The champagne flowed endlessly, and the bride and groom looked like they had stepped right out of a fairy tale. Everything was perfect, until the best man stood up. At first, it seemed like just another toast. He clinked his glass grinning, swaying slightly from too much wine. The room fell silent as people turned to watch. The bride smiled politely, the groom chuckling as he leaned back in his chair. Then the best man, Daniel, cleared his throat and said, "Well, I had a speech prepared, but after everything I've seen today, I need to say something from the heart." The groom raised an eyebrow. The bride's smile faltered. Daniel took a deep breath. "I know weddings are supposed to be about celebrating love, but the truth is, not all love stories end up how they're supposed to." A murmur ran through the crowd. The bride's grip tightened on her fork. The groom sat up straighter. Daniel turned to face the bride direct. "Because the truth is, I think we both know. This was supposed to be our wedding." The entire room collectively sucked in a breath. The bride's face turned to stone. The groom's knuckles turned white around his glass. Daniel let out a shaky laugh. "I've loved you for years," he said, his voice cracking. "And I should have told you sooner. I should have fought for you. I should have been the one waiting for you at the altar today." The silence was suffocating. The bride's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. A cold, sharp fury. The groom placed his drink down with an eerie calmness. Someone at a nearby table whispered, "Holy sh!" before their date elbowed them into silence. Daniel took a step closer, desperation creeping into his voice. "You don't have to do this. You don't have to marry him. If there's even a chance you feel the same way." The bride stood. She didn't look shocked or conflicted. She looked furious. "Daniel," she said, voice like ice, "how dare you?" Daniel blinked. How dare you make this about you?" The groom crossed his arms, his jaw clenched. The room was deathly silent. The bride's hands were shaking, not from nerves but from rage. "You had years, and you wait until my wedding day." Daniel's bravado cracked. He looked around the room, searching for support. He found nothing but glares. The bride's voice dropped. "I don't love you." "I never did." Daniel inhaled sharply, like she had struck him. The groom finally spoke. "You should leave." Daniel hesitated. Then, defeated, he lowered his gaze. Without another word, he turned and walked out. The doors shut behind him. A beat of silence. Then the DJ, knowing exactly what to do, hit play. The music returned. The bride exhaled, sat down, and took her husband's hand. "Still perfect," he whispered. She smiled. And just like that it was. Story 13. The wedding was flawless. Candles flickering on every table, a live string quartet playing softly in the background, and an atmosphere so warm and joyous that even the most cynical guests couldn't help but smile. The bride and groom were glowing, their love radiating through the room. Dinner had just been served when the moment that would be talked about for years happened. A loud scrape echoed through the venue as someone pushed their chair back abrupt. Heads turned, conversations stopped. It was Adam, the groom's older brother. The bride's stomach dropped. The groom tensed beside her. Adam, already a few drinks in, wobbled slightly as he stood, raising his glass. I need to say something," Adam announced, his voice thick with emotion. The guests exchanged wary glances. The best man, seated next to him, reached out as if to stop him, but Adam shook his head. No, I need to say this." The groom shot him a warning look, but Adam didn't even glance his way. Instead, his gaze locked onto the bride. The bride felt ice crawl up her spine. "I've been holding this in for years," Adam continued, his voice growing strong, "but I can't any. I love you." A stunned silence fell over the room. The bride's breath hitched. The groom's grip on his knife tightened. Adam took a step forward. "I loved you first," he said. "Before my brother ever even knew your name. I saw you before he did. I wanted you before he did." The guests collectively held their breath. The bride's pulse pounded in her ears. She glanced at her husband, but his face was unreadable, his jaw locked in stone-cold silence. Adam laughed bitterly. "I told myself I'd move on, that if you chose him, I'd let it go. But watching you walk down that aisle today," he swallowed hard. "It should have been me." The air in the room was suffocating. Then the groom finally stood, his chair scraping sharply against the floor. His voice was quiet, but it carried through the entire hall. "Sit down, Adam." Adam shook his head. "I won't pretend anymore. I won't act like this doesn't hurt." He turned back to the bride. "You don't have to go through with this. If there's even a chance you feel the same way." The bride slowly stood. She wasn't shaking. She wasn't crying. She was furious. Her voice, though calm, cut through the tension like a blade. "Adam," she said, "you are embarrassing yourself." Adam flinched. The bride inhaled sharply, her hands trembling at her sides. "You had years to tell me this." "Years, Adam. And you wait until my wedding day?" Adam opened his mouth, but she cut him off. You weren't first. You were never even close to being first. The groom took a step forward. You need to leave. Now. Adam's face crumbled. He hesitated, looking around the room, but there was no support. No sympathy. Just uncomfortable silence. The realization hit him all at once. Without another word, he turned and walked out. The doors shut behind him with a heavy thud. For a moment, no one spoke. Then, mercifully, the DJ pressed play. Music filled the room once again. The bride let out a slow breath and turned back to her husband. You okay? He murmured. She took his hand and squeezed. Perfect, she whispered. And just like that, the wedding continued. Story 14. The wedding had been a dream. White roses lining the aisle, golden chandeliers casting a soft glow, and a dance floor filled with nothing but love and laughter. The bride and groom looked happier than ever, lost in each other's eyes as they swayed to their first dance. Then, just as the song was reaching its most beautiful note, someone clinked a glass. Loudly, the music cut off. Guests turned their heads. A man stood at his table, clearing his throat. It was Tyler, the bride's ex-boyfriend. A ripple of whispers spread through the room. The groom's jaw tensed. The bride stiffened. Tyler smiled sheepishly, raising his glass. Sorry, I just wanted to say something, the best man muttered. Oh, for the love of... Under his breath, Tyler exhaled sharply. Look, I wasn't planning to do this. I swear. But seeing all this, seeing her, his eyes locked onto the bride, soft with something that shouldn't have been there. It just made me realize I can't stay silent. The bride's grip on her dress tight. The groom's fingers curled into a fist. Tyler took a step forward. I know we ended things a long time ago, but that doesn't change how I feel. It doesn't change the fact that I still... The bride cut him off. Her voice was cold. Tyler. Don't. Tyler faltered. He swallowed hard, glancing at the guests. Some looked uncomfortable, some were openly horrified. The bride's father, seated nearby, was gripping his fork like he was considering using it as a weapon. Tyler pressed on. I just need to know, before you say your vows, is there any part of you that still loves me? The silence was unbearable. The bride let out a slow, controlled breath. Then she smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. It was the kind of smile that sent chills down your spine. Tyler, she said softly, do you know what today is? He hesitated. Your wedding. Exactly, she said. My wedding, not your second chance. The guests murmured in agreement. The groom finally spoke. His voice was deadly calm. Tyler, you need to leave. Tyler blinked, as if just now realizing what he'd done. The bride took a step toward him. You weren't invited, she whispered, and now you never will be again. Tyler's face turned pale. He opened his mouth like he wanted to say something, but nothing came out. The weight of humiliation sank in. Slowly, he turned and walked toward the exit. The doors closed behind him. For a moment, the room was still. Then the DJ, in a stroke of genius, hit play on the music again. The dance floor lit up. Guests laughed, the tension cracking like glass. The bride turned back to her husband, their eyes meeting. You okay? He asked. She smirked. Never better. And just like that, the wedding continued. Story 15. The wedding was perfect. Fairy lights draped across the ceiling, soft music humming in the background, and a bride and groom so in love that nothing could possibly ruin their day. Or so they thought. Dinner had just been served when a voice suddenly rang out over the chatter. Wait, the clinking of silverware stopped. Conversations died mid-sentence. Heads turned. A man stood near the back of the room, his chair shoved aside. It was Evan, the bride's co-worker. The bride's stomach twisted into knots. The groom's face darkened. Evan cleared his throat, rubbing his hands together nervously. I know this is unexpected. I know I probably shouldn't do this. But I can't stay silent. The room was dead quiet. The bride swallowed hard. Evan, she warned. He ignored her. I've been in love with you for years, Evan blurted out. A wave of gasps rippled through the crowd. Someone at a nearby table whispered, What the hell? The bride's mother dropped her. The groom's best man tensed, ready to intervene. The bride's hands trembled as she pushed herself up from her seat. Evan, she hissed, sit down. But he wasn't finished. You never noticed, Evan continued, his voice shaking. You never saw it. But every time we worked late together, every time you laughed at my jokes, every time you told me about your dates with him, he gestured to the groom without even looking at it. I was dying inside. The groom slowly stood, his eyes locked onto Evan like a predator sizing up its prey. The bride felt a fury rise in her chest. You're insane, she whispered. This is my wedding. Evan exhaled shakily. I know. And maybe I'm a fool. But if I don't say this now, I'll regret it for the rest of my life. The bride's fingers curled into fists. She didn't hesitate. She walked straight toward him, her voice calm but sharp as a blade. You regret it? She repeated. You? Evan nodded, his eyes desperate. I just need to know. If there's any part of you that feels the same, the bride laughed. Not a warm laugh. A cold, bitter. Let me make this clear, she said, stepping so close he had no choice but to meet her gaze. There is nothing. There was never anything. And after this, I will never speak to you again. Evan's face fell. His hands trembled. The groom took 2 steps forward. You're leaving, he said. Evan looked around, searching for sympathy. He found none. His shoulders sagged. He let out a weak, defeated chuckle. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out of the venue. The doors shut behind him. Silence. Then, mercifully, the DJ hit play. The music swelled. The tension shattered. The bride exhaled, shaking her head as she returned to her husband's side. He leaned in, murmuring, "You okay?" She smirked. "Let's dance." And just like that, the wedding moved on, without Evan.